Under a drizzling sky, Marcus Williams navigated Main Street cautiously, his windshield wipers struggling against the persistent rain. The long, exhausting day behind him left his mind yearning for nothing more than a hot shower and silence. But as red and blue lights pierced through his rearview mirror, a familiar sense of dread crept over him. Marcus pulled over, hands gripping the steering wheel, at 10 and 2, following the protocol ingrained in him. He knew he hadn't been speeding. His taillights and plates were in perfect order. Yet, as he braced himself for the interaction, he couldn't ignore the nagging thought this was just another case of driving while black. The police cruiser parked, and out stepped Officer Craig Douglas, a towering figure exuding authority. With boots crunching on the wet pavement, his demeanor screamed dominance. Without so much as a greeting, Douglas barked, "License and registration." His tone carried not a hint of civility, just a sharp, commanding edge. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice steady. "You're driving suspiciously slow," Douglas replied, squinting at Marcus like he'd committed an unspoken offense. Marcus blinked in disbelief. "Suspiciously slow?" "It's raining," he explained, his calm tone masking rising frustration. Douglas leaned closer to the window, his hat dripping with rain. "Careful, huh? You got something to hide in this car?" The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. "No, officer, everything's in order," Marcus replied as he carefully retrieved his license and registration. But as Douglas snatched the papers and stomped back to his cruiser, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was far from over. The tension hung in the air, heavy as the storm clouds above. As Marcus sat quietly in his car, watching Officer Douglas in the side mirror, the tension was palpable. The officer lingered in his cruiser longer than necessary, a move Marcus recognized as an intimidation tactic. When Douglas finally emerged, his irritation was evident. His expression hardened, as if he had been searching for a reason to escalate the situation and failed to find one. "Step out of the vehicle," Douglas demanded, as he approached the car. "What's the reason, officer?" Marcus asked, his tone polite yet firm. He had done nothing wrong, and knew his rights. "Step out of the vehicle," Douglas repeated, his words sharper now, delivered with a deliberate emphasis, as though Marcus hadn't understood the first time. With a resigned sigh, Marcus complied, unbuckling his seatbelt and stepping out into the cold drizzle. His jacket quickly soaked through as he stood by the side of the car, hands visible to avoid any misunderstandings. "Open the trunk," Douglas ordered, gesturing toward the back of the vehicle. "Officer, with all due respect, you need a warrant for that," Marcus replied, keeping his tone steady despite the frustration building inside him. He knew the law, and Douglas's demand was out of bounds. The officer's face twisted into a smirk, the kind that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "You see, that's where you're wrong. I can check whatever I damn well please." "No, you can't," Marcus countered, his voice firm. "You are violating my rights." But Douglas ignored him entirely, marching to the trunk as if he owned the car. He fumbled with his key ring, then forcibly popped the trunk open, blatantly disregarding Marcus's protests. The sound of the latch clicking open felt like a thunderclap in the tension-filled night. "Officer, you're out of line!" Marcus shouted, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and apprehension. Douglas, however, was unfazed, digging into the trunk like a child hunting for a prize. That's when his smug confidence faltered. His hand froze mid-reach as his eyes landed on the sleek gray document case tucked neatly in the corner. His expression shifted, curiosity morphing into something far darker, as the confrontation took an unexpected turn. As Officer Douglas rummaged through the trunk, his initial smugness radiated arrogance. Marcus stood silently, his fists clenched, watching the blatant violation of his rights. Then, the officer's gaze landed on a sleek gray document case, neatly positioned in the corner of the trunk. He hesitated, curiosity flashing across his face. "What's this?" Douglas asked, his tone sharp with suspicion. "That's personal property," Marcus replied firmly. "You have no right." But Douglas ignored him, his hand already reaching for the case. He lifted it with a self-satisfied smirk, as if he'd found the smoking gun to justify his actions. "Let's see what you're hiding," he muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. "Put it down," Marcus said, his voice calm but resolute. Inside, his heart raced as he anticipated what was coming. Douglas, however, was undeterred. He popped the latches with a click, flipping the case open with exaggerated bravado. The moment his eyes fell on the top document, his confidence shattered. The color drained from his face, leaving him ashen, like a ghost. He blinked several times, his eyes darting across the page, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "What the shit?" he stammered, his voice now stripped of its authority. His hands trembled slightly as he held the document closer to his face, scanning the bold letters at the top. Notice of termination. Beneath it, his name, Craig Douglas, was printed in large, unmistakable text, followed by a damning list of offenses that left no room for interpretation. Marcus crossed his arms, leaning casually against the car. "What's the matter, Officer Douglas?" he asked, his voice laced with calm amusement. "Something catch your eye?" Douglas looked up at Marcus, his expression a mix of confusion and terror. The realization of what he had just uncovered hit him like a freight train. In an instant, the power dynamic shifted entirely, and the officer, once so confident, now stood paralyzed, exposed in his own wrongdoing. As Officer Douglas stared at the document in disbelief, the weight of the moment began to sink in. The bold words at the top, notice of termination, followed by his name and a detailed list of his offenses, were undeniable. His hands trembled, and his once smug demeanor had completely evaporated. He looked up at Marcus, his face pale and his confidence shattered. This can't be real," Douglas stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell is this?" Marcus pushed himself off the car, standing tall as he locked eyes with the officer. "That, Officer Douglas," he said slowly, his tone calm but cutting, "is a very official document, and you're holding it without permission, by the way." Douglas blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. You're not serious," he managed to choke out, the panic in his voice growing. "You can't be—" "Oh, I'm very serious," Marcus interrupted, crossing his arms. "You see, I was brought in to clean up this department. Chief Peterson thought it was time to deal with officers like you. And guess what? Your name was right at the top of my list." Douglas's jaw tightened as he stared back at the paper, his mind visibly racing to process the implications. "Wait. You're not—" "That's right," Marcus said, cutting him off again. "I'm your new boss, Douglas, and congratulations, you've just given me first-hand proof of why you're unfit to wear that badge." The officer's knees seemed to buckle slightly, his arrogance replaced by sheer terror. "Look, this is a misunderstanding," he began, his voice shaky. "I didn't know—" "And that makes it okay?" Marcus snapped, his voice rising. "You think it's acceptable to violate someone's rights just because you didn't know who they were? What if I wasn't your boss? Would you still think your actions tonight were justified?" Douglas had no response. His silence spoke volumes, and Marcus's presence only grew larger as the once dominant officer stood defeated, fully realizing the gravity of his situation. Marcus stood firm, arms crossed, as Officer Douglas struggled to regain his composure. The once commanding officer now looked like a man grasping at straws, his confidence shattered. "Look," Douglas began, his voice unsteady. "This is just a misunderstanding. I didn't mean anything by it. I didn't know who you were." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "And that's supposed to make it okay?" he shot back, his tone cutting through the tension like a blade. "You think it's acceptable to pull someone over for no reason, violate their rights, and rummage through their private property just because you didn't know they were your boss? Tell me, Douglas, what if I wasn't? Would you have treated me any differently?" The silence that followed was deafening. Douglas looked down at the ground, his boots shuffling in the rain, as if the answer he sought was somewhere in the puddles forming at his feet. But Marcus wasn't about to let him off the hook. "How many times have you pulled this kind of stunt?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising. How many people have you harassed or humiliated because you thought you could get away with it? How many didn't have a document in their trunk that forced you to backpedal? Douglas opened his mouth to respond but faltered, the words catching in his throat. Marcus leaned in slightly, his voice now lower but no less commanding. "That's what I thought," he said coldly. "You're not sorry you did it. You're sorry you got caught." "Please," Douglas said, his tone desperate now. "I didn't mean anything by it. This job, it's all I've got. I made a mistake, okay? But I can learn. I can change." Marcus let his words hang in the air for a moment, letting the weight of the officer's pleas settle. The rain continued to fall, soaking them both. But Marcus didn't care. This wasn't about the rain or the discomfort. It was about accountability, something Douglas had clearly evaded for far too long. "You want to change?" Marcus finally said, his voice steady. "Then prove it, but not in my department." Douglas's face crumpled like paper, his desperation morphing into despair. "You can't do this," he whispered, barely audible. "I need this job." "No," Marcus corrected him, his tone sharp and unforgiving. "What you needed was a wake-up call. Consider this it." Douglas stared at him, disbelief etched into every line of his face. The weight of Marcus's words and the reality of his own actions pressed down on him like a freight train. For the first time, he seemed to understand that there was no escape from the consequences he had set in motion. Marcus pulled out his phone, his expression calm yet resolute. Officer Douglas stood frozen, his face pale, the document still clutched in his trembling hands. "Please," Douglas stammered, desperation seeping into his voice. "You don't have to do this. I can fix this. I'll apologize." Marcus let out a bitter chuckle. "Apologize?" he repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Tell me, Douglas, how many people have you apologized to after pulling this kind of stunt? Or is this the first time you've been caught?" Douglas's silence was answer enough. Marcus dialed a number, the familiar voice of Chief Peterson answering almost immediately. "Chief, it's me," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I've got Officer Douglas here with me. Effective immediately, he's terminated. Notify HR and expedite the paperwork." Douglas's eyes widened in sheer panic as Marcus spoke, his hands dropping to his sides. Wait, he pleaded, his voice breaking. "You don't have to do this. Please, I'll do whatever it takes." Marcus raised a hand, silencing him. "It's done, Douglas. Pack your things and turn in your badge and gun by the end of the day. And don't even think about appealing your record. Speaks for itself." The phone call ended with a curt click, and Marcus turned back to the officer. "Here's a tip," Marcus said, stepping closer. "Next time, if anyone's ever foolish enough to give you another uniform, remember what it's supposed to stand for. Protect and serve, not harass and intimidate." Douglas stood there, drenched and defeated, as Marcus retrieved the document case and closed the trunk. The rain continued to fall, but Marcus felt an undeniable sense of justice. For once, the system had held someone accountable, and Marcus knew this moment would serve as a turning point for Douglas and the department he was determined to reform. Marcus stepped closer to Douglas, his tone firm and unyielding. "Here's a lesson for you," he said, his voice cutting through the rain. "The uniform you wear isn't a license to harass or intimidate. It's a duty to protect and serve. Remember that, if anyone ever trusts you enough to give you another chance." Douglas stood there, soaked and silent, his arrogance replaced by defeat. The weight of Marcus's words settled over him like the rain, leaving him to confront the reality of his actions and their lasting consequences. This story sheds light on the pervasive issue of systemic misconduct within law enforcement and the urgent need for accountability. It underscores the importance of empowering individuals to challenge abuses of power and demand justice, regardless of the odds. True reform begins with holding those in authority to the standards they pledge to uphold, protecting, and serving with integrity. Let this serve as a call to action for both citizens and leaders to advocate for transparency, fairness, and meaningful change within our justice system. Together, we can ensure that authority is wielded responsibly and that no one is above the law. If you like this story, Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell to stay updated with the next interesting stories.